On December 17, 2025, President Donald Trump made a stunning announcement that sent shockwaves across the globe. Standing at the White House podium, he declared a total naval and air blockade of Venezuela, a move that would instantly become one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of his presidency. Trump proclaimed that Venezuela was now surrounded by the largest armada ever assembled in South American waters. Warships and aircraft from the US and its allies formed an imposing ring around the country, signaling a new era of military pressure. This dramatic escalation is the culmination of years of mounting tensions between Washington and Caracas. The US had long refused to recognize Nicolas Maduro's government, instead supporting opposition leader Juan Guaidó. A series of crippling economic sanctions had already devastated Venezuela's economy, leading to widespread shortages and unrest. Now, with the blockade, the standoff has reached a boiling point. The blockade specifically targets all oil tankers sanctioned by the US, preventing them from entering or leaving Venezuelan waters. This move strikes at the very heart of Venezuela's economy, which relies almost entirely on oil exports for survival. The country's ability to trade, import food, and access medicine is now in jeopardy. In the days leading up to the announcement, US military forces had already seized a Venezuelan oil tanker and launched attacks on several vessels suspected of violating sanctions. These aggressive actions signaled a dramatic shift from economic pressure to direct military enforcement, raising fears of a wider conflict. The international community has been thrown into turmoil. The United Nations has called an emergency session, with diplomats fiercely debating the legality of the blockade and the broader implications for international law and national sovereignty. World leaders are scrambling to respond as the risk of escalation grows by the hour. What began as a political standoff has now erupted into a live military confrontation. Armed forces on both sides are on high alert, and the world is watching as nations are forced to choose sides in a rapidly intensifying crisis that could reshape the future of the region. The Trump administration justifies the blockade by accusing Venezuela of stealing American assets, citing the nationalization of US-invested oil facilities and the loss of Citgo. Washington frames these actions as expropriation, while also alleging the Maduro regime is deeply involved in drug trafficking and human smuggling. The administration has moved to designate Maduro's government as a foreign terrorist organization, granting sweeping powers to prosecute supporters and freeze assets. By labeling Venezuela a terrorist state, the US seeks to isolate it globally and legitimize the blockade as a counter-terrorism operation. This narrative reframes military encirclement as self-defense and regional stabilization, rather than an act of war. The blockade is a massive, highly coordinated military operation, deploying a formidable array of US Navy warships to the Caribbean. These vessels form a visible and intimidating presence, projecting American power across the region and sending a clear message to both allies and adversaries. The scale of the operation is unprecedented in recent years, involving not just surface ships but also advanced support and logistics vessels to maintain a constant state of readiness. Alongside the warships, a fleet of surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft patrols the skies, monitoring Venezuela's maritime and aerial approaches around the clock. These aircraft, equipped with cutting-edge sensors and radar, can detect and track vessels and aircraft from hundreds of miles away, ensuring that no movement goes unnoticed. Warships from the Fourth Fleet are tasked with patrolling strategic sea lanes, intercepting and seizing US-sanctioned oil tankers attempting to trade with Venezuela. These interdictions are often tense, involving boarding parties and the threat of escalation if vessels refuse to comply. Surveillance planes like the P-8 Poseidon play a crucial role, tracking suspect vessels long before they near Venezuelan waters. Their intelligence is relayed in real time to naval commanders, allowing for rapid response and precise interdiction operations. The US has already seized several Venezuelan tankers, sometimes using lethal force during anti-drug operations. These actions send a stark warning to others. The threshold for violence is low, and the US is prepared to escalate if challenged. White House rhetoric is blunt. Officials have declared, "We'll keep blowing boats up until Maduro cries uncle." This uncompromising stance is meant to deter would-be violators and demonstrate unwavering resolve. The blockade's enforcement is highly selective, targeting only sanctioned vessels. This creates a chaotic maritime environment, where legitimate commercial shipping and shadowy sanction-busting operations intermingle, making it difficult to distinguish friend from foe. Chevron, operating under special U.S. authorization, continues its oil shipments undisturbed. Meanwhile, shadow fleets, often sailing under false flags or with transponders switched off, attempt to slip through the blockade, risking interception and seizure. This selective enforcement breeds confusion and increases the risk of dangerous encounters at sea as commercial crews, smugglers, and military personnel all navigate an increasingly unpredictable and volatile maritime landscape. President Maduro has condemned the blockade as imperialist aggression and vowed to resist by all means necessary. Venezuela's UN envoy labeled the U.S. seizure of oil tankers as state piracy, accusing Washington of violating international law. Caracas is rallying global opposition, calling for an emergency UN Security Council session and seeking support from allies like Russia and China. Domestically, Maduro frames the crisis as a patriotic struggle, using it to unite the nation and distract from internal turmoil. The message from Caracas is clear. Venezuela will not surrender its sovereignty no matter the hardship. The blockade delivers a devastating blow to Venezuela's oil-dependent economy, threatening to cut off a third of its daily exports almost overnight. Oil is the lifeblood of Venezuela's finances, and this sudden disruption sends shockwaves through every sector of the country. With exports slashed, government revenue could plummet by as much as 80%, leaving public services and social programs starved for funds. The government scrambles to find alternative buyers and sources of income, but options are limited. Global oil prices surge in response as markets react to fears of prolonged supply disruptions and escalating geopolitical tensions. Traders brace for volatility, and energy-importing nations worry about rising costs. Yet, despite the blockade, a significant portion of Venezuela's oil continues to reach China and other buyers through a shadow fleet of tankers. These ships operate under false flags and circuitous routes, skillfully evading U.S. sanctions and international tracking. Meanwhile, Chevron, protected by a special U.S. license, maintains its operations in Venezuela. This exception highlights the selective and strategic nature of the sanctions, as Washington seeks to balance economic pressure with its own energy interests. These loopholes offer President Maduro a narrow lifeline, allowing some revenue to trickle in. Still, the financial blow is severe, with inflation soaring and shortages of basic goods worsening for ordinary Venezuelans. International companies operating in Venezuela now face deep uncertainty. Many are caught between U.S. regulations and the risk of losing access to valuable resources, as the U.S. tries to cripple Maduro's regime while safeguarding its own strategic interests. The result is a volatile market, with wild swings in prices and a precarious economic future for millions of Venezuelans. Everyday life grows more difficult as the crisis deepens. Ultimately, the blockade's selective enforcement reveals the complex web of political calculations and competing interests that drive this high-stakes military and economic confrontation. The blockade's harshest impact will fall on ordinary Venezuelans, already suffering from shortages and a collapsed economy. Humanitarian groups warn that even a targeted blockade will deter shipping, threatening food and medical imports. Aid organizations fear the blockade could turn crisis into catastrophe for millions, as inflation soars and basic goods become unaffordable. The economic shock is expected to trigger mass migration, straining neighboring countries. Humanitarian exemptions are urgently needed to prevent collective punishment of the population. Without them, the blockade risks deepening the suffering of Venezuela's most vulnerable. The blockade has ignited fierce debate in the U.S., exposing deep divisions over war powers and foreign policy. Democrats, led by Congressman Joaquin Castro, call the blockade an unauthorized act of war and push for a resolution to end hostilities. Some Republicans, like Senator Josh Hawley, also oppose forced regime change, reflecting bipartisan skepticism of military intervention. The White House insists a ground invasion would require congressional approval, but claims broad authority for maritime and air operations. Chief of Staff Susie Wiles's blunt rhetoric underscores the administration's militant stance. Critics argue the president has usurped Congress's constitutional authority, setting up a major political showdown. The outcome will shape not only Venezuela policy but the future balance of war powers in the U.S. The blockade has drawn global condemnation, with Russia and China denouncing it as an act of war and vowing support for Venezuela. The European Union urges restraint and a return to negotiations, fearing regional destabilization and humanitarian disaster. The UN Security Council convenes emergency talks, but divisions among major powers make consensus unlikely. The crisis challenges the post-war order, setting a dangerous precedent for unilateral military action. Disruption to oil supplies and the risk of wider conflict threaten the global economy. The situation could escalate if US and Venezuelan forces clash or if Russian or Chinese vessels are targeted. For now, the world watches anxiously, hoping diplomacy prevails before conflict spirals out of control.